Thank you all for joining us for today's conversation with Gene Kim, 5 Ideals for Building Software. My name is Dave Karow. I'm the Continuous Delivery Evangelist here at Split. Before I tell you a little about myself, I think we should talk about our sort of guest of honor, whatever, Gene. So Gene, I'll read your official bio and then I'll elaborate a little bit, right? So Gene Kim is a multiple award-winning CTO, researcher, and author, and has been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999. Since 2014, he's been the founder and organizer of DevOps Enterprise Summit, studying the technology transformation of large, complex organizations. So here's where we get into a little of the color. Gene co-authored 2 of my favorite DevOps books, the DevOps Handbook, along with Jez Humble, Patrick Dubois, and John Willis, and John Elspaugh, and Accelerate, along with lead author Dr. Nicole Fosgren and Jez Humble as well. So those are 2 of my favorites. I usually bring a dog-eared copy of the DevOps. And then, so for those, most of you probably know this, but the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project are dramatizations of a sort of a real-world legacy IT challenges and the modern software delivery solutions that address them. And I can't think of another DevOps book where I found myself sort of cheering for the good guys and eye-rolling and booing out loud and reacting to the, let's just say, not yet enlightened. So very glad you could be with us today, Gene. Thank you very much.
Dave, so great to be here, and so great to be on with the famous Pete as well.
Yes, so let's move on to the famous Pete. So Pete Hodgson is an independent software delivery consultant who focuses on enabling software teams to deliver awesome software at sustainable pace. Before going independent, he was a principal consultant with ThoughtWorks and worked as a tech lead and architect at a couple startups. So then here we go. Here comes the color part. That was his official bio, right? So Pete wrote the authoritative blog post on feature flags, feature toggles, feature flippers at martinfowler.com. He also wrote an excellent read called Feature Branching versus Feature Flags, What's the Right Tool for the Job? It's on devops.com. I wrote a blog post about managing monolith breakup when stateful services are involved that has sent a ton of traffic to DZone and Split's own blog where it was first published. He is also the author of an O'Reilly book entitled Continuous Delivery in the Wild, which will be published in early 2020.
Yay!
Yay. So Pete tweets as PH1 on Twitter. So on that note, just a little bit about me. So I am the Continuous Delivery Evangelist. And as I put it in my bio, you know, my job is basically to listen to software leaders, people who are pushing the envelope of what's possible, and then share. So I do webinars, I do meetups, conferences, and I have a snackable blog and video series about progressive delivery that's called Safe at Any Speed. And by snackable, I mean short and digestible. You can literally bring up the playlist in YouTube. The whole thing runs in less than 25 minutes. So anybody who wants to learn progressive delivery, feature flags, experimentation, how are people actually using this to great effect, you can literally do it in half a lunch break. So on that note, Gene, I thought what we would do at the top is just have you kind of give a summary, an overview of the Unicorn Project, and why did you write it, who'd you write it for, maybe give us an overview of the ideals and such.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, how's yeah, so why another book? And there's specifically a couple problems that I gravitated towards I wanted to explore more fully in the book. One was this problem that that there's this absence of visibility to what is really required to enable developers to be productive, to enable them to be able to develop, test, and deploy value to customers independently. Secondly, there was this other problem of how that's kind of orthogonal to the problem that the DevOps community rightly pointed at, which was it was so difficult to get code to where it needed to get to, which was in production, so that customers could get value from what we created. The orthogonal problem is around data. How do we get data that's often imprisoned in systems of records and data warehouses? How do we get it to where it needs to go, which is in the hands of developers, so that we can use it in our daily work? There's often strong oppositions to support new ways of working, and there's often ambiguity from what we need from our leaders to support these transformations to a better, safer, happier way of working. And so the instruments I use in the Unicorn Project are the 5 ideals that you alluded to, Dave. And so the first ideal is locality and simplicity. And so that's the notion of, to what degree can we make changes in one place as opposed to having it splattered everywhere, and to what extent can decisions be made within the team versus having to escalate up to, over to, and down to for everything. The second ideal is what I think are the outcomes of doing that, which is that engineers we can work with focus, flow, and joy. And so that really is harks back to Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work around when he says flow is as a description of when we're having so much fun and getting so much out of the work we do that we lose sense of time, maybe even sense of self. Third is what is required to get there. We need to prioritize improvement of daily work, even over daily work itself. So greatness is never free. Greatness is created, and we can't do that if we're just working just on features, right? We have to pay down technical debt, work on dev productivity, and so forth. Fourth is psychological safety. It was fun to go through the State of DevOps report and look at sort of the Project Austrian study that was done at Google for many years, where they really identified what made great teams great was psychological safety, which is very consistent to the findings out of the State of DevOps report that went into the Accelerate book. And the fifth is customer focus, the ideal of the notion of core versus context. This came from Dr. Geoffrey Moore, who wrote the Crossing the Chasm book, and even the better book, which is Zones to Win. And he describes that core versus context. Core are the things that customers care about. They're willing to pay us for. They are the things that we work on that create competitive advantage, lasting, durable business advantage. And context is everything else. So context is often mission critical, but it's not something that customers are willing to pay us for. And so maybe having world-class payroll services is great, but that's something that typically customers don't value. And so that is context, as opposed to core. And the reason why this is important is that Dr. Moore points out that for many large, complex organizations, context is starving core, right? And so this context has to be managed and often managed down. So those are the concepts that I really gravitated towards, and I really formed the key concepts I think are important that are in the Unicorn Project. And hopefully that resonated with you as you went through the book in terms of things that also you value, Dave.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask as a follow-up. So, in Accelerate, I think there's a list of 24, 28 or something sort of best practices. And my guess was that you wanted a shorter list that people could be more likely to remember off the top of their head. But I'm kind of curious why 5 ideals, and why boil it down to 5?
Why 5? Yeah, it's boy, oh, what a great
7
question.
plus or minus 2.
Yeah. It's sort of like that Mark Twain quote. I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time. I think it was really kind of forcing myself to, in fact, just to tell you the real story. I remember around January of this year, and Pete, maybe you can resonate with some elements of this, is that you hit sort of manuscript complete. No, you're not manuscript complete. You're done with the first draft. And I had sort of overproduced. I had written 150,000 words, and I was going to edit it down to 120,000 words. I remember looking at it and telling my friend Mick Kirsten, Dr. Mick Kirsten, he's CEO of TaskTop, and I told him, I have no idea what this is about. I wrote 150,000 words, and it's just a big pile of words saying nothing. And it was after a couple of days that kind of was born out of those discussions with the 5 ideals. What I really think the point is it's a book about coupling. And the first idea is really about what do we need to do to design things in a way that we can do things independent of each other. And that's kind of the notion of simplicity from Rich Hickey, who created the closure programming language. And I think the outcomes are these experiential notions of focus, flow, and joy. So beyond all the IT performance, software delivery performance measures in the State of DevOps report, I think what we all want out of it is a sense of meaning and engagement, and we feel like we can actually do the work we want to do. And then the notion of values, right? Do we really prioritize and make room for improvement of daily work? And that requires also psychological safety and the customer focus. So yeah, it is. I don't think it's a isomorphic or catamorphic mapping of the technical practice architectural norms. It's really the ones that I really gravitated towards, and I think I wanted to give voice to in something very concentrated.
So shorter list better. Go ahead, Pete.
That's interesting. So you came up with the ideas, those 5 ideals you kind of extracted after writing the book. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think I went into it really saying that this is a book about coupling, and then you write 1,000 words at a time, and then you get to the end and you try to kind of sift through the poo for the peanuts. And
really looking. I'm impressed because it seems like from reading the book, it feels like it certainly comes across as those these five ideals are these kind of platonic truths, and the book was kind of built around them. So.
Well, and from as a fellow writers, right? I mean, the exercise that came back was extremely painful. Well, in fact, in some ways, it was very simple, right? I got rid of everything that didn't have to do with the five ideals.
Yeah,
and that had to probably shore up some things, but I think those were the very much the key components that were so important that everything else that didn't have to deal with it went away.
I think what I really liked from reading the book, and what I really liked is that like, you know, I was kind of joking a little bit about these being kind of platonic truths, but like these are like very fundamental ideas, and then you can kind of apply them in a lot of different contexts. Like it's really I love those kind of like values or ideals that are kind of easy to understand, but then you start thinking about like, whoa, like trunk-based development is kind of like about focus and flow, and like, wow, I think it's kind of cool. And it's kind of cool in reading through the book. You have a few examples where when there's this kind of whole second half about data engineering, and you can still kind of apply these same ideals as much to data engineering as you can to like DevOps or you know, test automation. So I think that's one of the things I really loved about the book. Like I love these kind of things where people can internalize them and then start kind of applying them in their context. I think it's just super valuable.
Awesome. And coming from your, you know, deep body work and your stature in the industry, I mean, that means so much to me. And I think one of the things one of my favorite scenes was the merge scene, right? Like, Maxine observed for 3 days, 50 people trapped in 2 war rooms because the war rooms weren't big enough. They had to make another, and just a profound waste. I mean, and it actually, she gets physically ill from seeing just the
like people are getting ill, right? Because they're like having to spend so much time doing like in proximity, and I've got to say, like the first part of the book where she, you know, she joins this team and she's just like super, you know, she's spending like days. Maxine is spending kind of days and days just trying to get like the build running, and there's people who have been in their cube for 2 years and they still haven't got it running. Like that like triggered like almost some PTSD for me of like, you know, when I've been in like landed in some bigger like, it was a little too real for me.
And what I find so magnificent about that is that the feeling from the highest levels of leadership is that we need more developers. We need to land these developers, and yet they're all stuck. And you take a supremely skilled engineer, and even she can't do a build. My kind of mental model for that was like Robinson Crusoe, or Tom Hanks in Castaway, where even with the highest order of skill, you still can't do anything.
So I thought it was also really great the way you wove in reasonable reactions that these people had that were totally counter to what would help. Like, the way Sarah is like, she's probably not intentionally trying to sabotage, at least not at the beginning, right? And yet, or like, just over and over again, you sort of, people have react like, oh, merging is hard, so let's do it less often.
Right.
Like, okay, because we build up a lot of debt and things that are confusing every time we make a change, let's make more changes before we try to unwind the chaos. Like if you just step back and think about it, it's like intuitively obvious, and yet people are like, oh, merging is hard, well, let's try to do that quarterly instead of monthly or whatever, right?
Yeah, and it's it's funny. My own personal experience is I work on a lot of solo projects. I have a lot of feature branches just to kind of keep the work separate and sort of keep it from interfering with each other. And my personal experience over the last year is that I can't even merge successfully with myself. Right? I mean, there are some times where I actually retype the changes in because the automated merge is so baffling to me. And to me, my kind of visceral learning out of that is like, if I can't even merge with myself at a kind of a slow rate of change, how can you possibly merge the work of hundreds of developers together, when they're arguably doing hundreds of lines of changes per day? And it's just, I think that the notion that you can do that is at best an illusion. It's no doubt in my mind. I have to imagine you've seen this these horrors at massive industrial scale.
I've got a question about that. So I I totally agree with that kind of sentiment of like, if it hurts, kind of do it more often, right? And I feel like maybe after you've done that and you've seen the light, then it's kind of seems obvious, like, yeah, do it more often. But I really struggle to sometimes to kind of bring people to the light when they haven't lived that reality. It does, like, on the face of it, when someone, if someone said to you on the face of it, if it hurts more, do it less often. That seems to make sense to me, right? So when I'm trying to sell it to people, the best I can do is show them that awesome John Allspaw slide with like the scary monster slide, like small.
Yes.
But like, how do you think? What's a good way of actually kind of getting people to grok that it hurts more, do it more often sounds kind of silly on the face.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, it's unfortunate. I have a friend who comes from a psychology background. The first time I said that, her reaction was, "Oh, that doesn't sound very logical." And it sounds like the Einstein definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and getting the consistent result. And so, yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that there is a kind of a room for misunderstanding there. And for me, what was really one of the most intellectually satisfying kind of aha moments, and it was actually during interaction with our mutual friend Jez Humble. It was this notion that it was really the dividing line between product design and development versus product integration, build, test, and deploy. And the notion that they're very two opposite, qualitatively different types of work. Product design and development, is by nature highly variable. Outcomes are highly uncertain. The work takes minutes. It doesn't take minutes or hours. It takes weeks, months, or days, right? And that's just the nature of design and development work. And often we do work never to be repeated again, right? So with code integration, code build, test, and deploy, those we want happening, quickly, ideally automated, ideally happening all the time, totally integrated into daily work. For me, it was that code deployment lead time, which shows up in the Accelerate book, is, simultaneously predicts the effectiveness of the, integrate, build, test, deploy step and it also provides feedback to developers on how quickly can we get, feedback on the quality of our work. And so kind of another way to say, if it hurts to do it more often, right, is to what extent can we integrate those activities into our daily work, right, so that they become less painful, because we are doing whatever it takes to make them less painful. So, I think I too kind of struggled with that, and it was sort of that one specific kind of depiction of that really kind of framed the aha moment for me.
I think there's a powerful way to put this for people for it be new, which is if you actually say instead, find the biggest constraint and solve or reduce it first and repeat. Because if you just say, if it's hard, do it more often, people are like, I'm human. What are you talking about? But if you say, find the thing, so do it often, figure out what's most painful and address the most painful things that are most of an obstacle first, and your job will get easier and more fun as you go, as opposed to, I don't want to do that thing that never works. No, do that thing that doesn't work until you can figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, in fact, a friend of mine, like someone else made a run at, and he said, yeah, if you're trying to run a marathon, chances are you have to practice more often. Practicing less often is certainly not going to take you closer to the goal, which I thought was pretty amusing.
Marathons are hard, so don't do any training.
Don't do any training.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
And by the way, I think it bears mentioning that even in our kind of rehearsal call, I think that the dot we often don't connect is that one of the big objections to doing trunk-based development is how can I possibly do work that does take weeks, months, or quarters and still merge the trunk. And I think that's one of the critical capabilities that feature flagging does allow, right? So that you can actually merge the code in and still make sure that that's not in the live code path, so that you're actually not jeopardizing the work of others. Which I think was actually a real aha moment, for me and it's I think a valid observation that feature flagging is not talked about enough as we talk about trunk-based development.
Yeah, you need to be able to make it less scary and be able to not have to recode things to change what's happening. I would say, Gene, when first time I saw this really pay off was I was at SOSTA And I've been a competitor with SOSTA for years, right? And then I got inside the four walls. And when I learned that for a developer to commit a UI change, they had to also commit a test to prove that it worked. And then those tests, I'm pretty sure they ran 3 times a day, right? And so the idea was you shouldn't be able to get past your morning coffee break or your lunch or your afternoon snack without having feedback that says either you broke your thing or you broke somebody else's thing. And then it's all fresh in your mind, right? And so people say, oh, moving that fast, that doesn't seem humane. And the paradox is that it's actually vastly more humane than being asked to fix a bug that you created 6 weeks ago, right?
Yeah, and we don't talk about that in the book, but yeah, I would say that's definitely kind of locality in terms of time, right? It's you want to. In fact, Facebook and Google, they've done a tremendous amount of work in terms of static code analysis, and one of they found was that the best time to tell people about a problem is when they're working on that area of the code. It's like when you're doing a change or where you're fixing an issue around that change, and anything. So if you do it, then you have like a 70 to 90% conversion rate to actually fixing a problem. If you do it in any period that's not when you're working on that area of the code, you have basically a 0% chance of having whatever you flag is being addressed. I just thought that was so I think that very much motivates your observation, Dave, that you have to, the only time we can reasonably kind of give feedback on something a developer worked on is when they're working on it. Well, 6 months later, there's no locality.
In the book you talk about it's not the big that win, it's the fast. And really that kind of applies at multiple levels. So this is one of those paradoxes where if you go to somebody and say, hey, I think you should build and release just way, way more often, an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude more than you're doing now, right? Then let's say they're a 6-month deployment shop, right? They're like, oh my God, that's so scary. And the fact of the matter is that if you do it very, very often, Dora, the report proves you're safer. Like people who actually turn the crank much faster, much more often, have fewer big incidents, they resolve any problems faster, they find things faster. Again, it gets back to, it's actually a more sustainable way to work than the 6-month death march.
For sure. Pete, I have to imagine that this resonates with your own experiences as well.
Absolutely. A lot. And I think like something that you just said around kind of that locality applying to kind of like temporal locality, that totally resonates with me, because I think those, to me, those two, like those first two ideals kind of play together a lot, right? So like definitely for me personally, flow is around like fast feedback loops, right? And that's for me, like as a individual engineer, but then also a team. Like there's been like a few times in my career where I've got to work on like really high performing teams, kind of like the team that you describe in the Unicorn project kind of gets that state. And that the thing that makes those teams so high performing, I think like the primary thing is that that feedback loop and the ability to I think it reduces the search space, right? So you do something and something changes and you're like, okay, well, what did I just do that caused that to happen? And it's like, is it a day's worth of things I did that had like a positive effect? Maybe, like we released this, we turned this thing on and we can see conversion rates increasing, or is it a negative thing, like all of the servers are crashing? And like
there's an in between there somewhere too. There's just the
right, and there's like the 95% of changes which are just like nothing, just I can go back to thinking about the next thing because they just kind of roll out. But like that search space being a few days versus some teams I've been on where it's 6 months of like tens or hundreds of engineers. It's just it's crazy that people would. It's crazy to me. I understand why, but it is, having been both sides of that, it is shocking to me that people still kind of feel like, oh, it would be way less stressful to be in that does not sound that, like maybe 5 months of the 6 months aren't as stressful, but that last month is like at least the average amount of stress is definitely higher.
And this is kind of this thing that it's just like a couple sentences in the Accelerate book, but to me it really speaks volumes. This is so there's a lot of measures in the Accelerate body of work, and there's a lot of technical practices, architectural practices, and cultural norms. but there's one thing that correlates all of them together, right? And you can predict, you can correlate, you can predict, you can correlate, you can ask one question and then take a pretty good guess at like any of the technical practices, architectural norms, measures, etc. By asking this one question: on a scale of 1 to 7, to what degree do we fear doing deployments? 1 is we have no fear at all, we just did one. 7 is we have existential fear of doing deployments. That is why in our ideal, the next time we will do a deployment is never. And it's just, to me, it just is almost poetic because it says, if we make deployments a part of our daily work, we can do things without fear. We get the feedback quickly, right? And we can, address it whether it's good or bad. In the existential fear case, we actually defer feedback, which actually makes our life worse and kind of guarantees that kind of all the wrong outcomes will happen as a result. And to me, I think that's kind of it just so much sums up kind of the are we getting better, or are we on a path that gets invariably worse?
Yeah, in the book, you actually when they're getting ready to do their sort of big Black Friday test, and they do the 1% first, right? And I think it was awesome that you point out we're doing this at 11 a.m. or whatever it was, 10 a.m., 11, what? And the reason we're doing it is everybody's here, everybody's rested, right? And we have a thing we talk about, which is killing the release night, right? Which is if you look back, Jez, when he explains why he wrote continuous delivery, says, on the one hand, we were telling people they should do this more often. And the other hand, we were always staying late whenever we were doing a release. And he didn't want to be in a situation where they were always, missing dinner or working the weekends because they were trying to work smarter or do better. And so they needed to make it just trivial to do a deployment, to be able to do a deployment, right? And I think that gets back to you want to do it when it shouldn't be drama. There shouldn't need to be heroics to do the thing you're supposed to be doing all the time anyway.
Yeah, and I wish I had made this a little more explicit in the Unicorn Project. So the notion of the dark launch, and that was another conversation with Jez Humble that blew my mind in terms of really understanding the Facebook chat launch story that happened in 2008, where they spent a year basically accumulating all the code needed to actually support this, and the use of Erlang, right? Things that had never been done before at such scale. And then it was just flipping a feature flag to go from 0 users to 70 million users overnight without a hitch. That was such I've heard the story many times, but until Jez really walked me through it, did it all sink in? I thought that was just the most amazing description of decoupling the launch, the deployment activities from the release. And I try to paint that picture in the Unicorn Project where, everything was there and now it's all release risk. And boy, there's a lot of release risk, but at least you don't have to worry about a lot of moving pieces. The release is not going to get gummed up by, a deployment going wrong, right? All those pieces are now in production. And now life is exciting enough trying to achieve the release objectives without having to throw in a bunch of deployment risk as well.
Yeah, the other part of that story in the middle, right, is really a testing and production story. Because what Facebook did initially, while it was dark, was it would load the chat agent in your browser, Mr. End User, Mr. and Mrs. End User, and it would actually chat with the back end to create traffic from a gazillion end users as if you were a human typing in the chat. And so they used the sort of massively distributed, they did their own sort of denial of service attack to make sure they could handle it, right? And so it was actually in your browser chatting with the back end before they ever made it visible. And what's funny is that they were, that was their dark launch, and the term has sort of evolved over time to be, when I give my talks, I'm like, hey, look, we've pushed out the code to exactly 0% of our users. Why would I do that? Well, because it's not ready yet, or we want to be able to test it in production without affecting any users yet, right? So these are concepts that people hear testing in production and they go, that's irresponsible. But it's, again, a lot of things are like crazy paradox.
Yeah, I think that's in the testing in production thing in some ways is kind of a little bit of an example of that. Well, maybe Gene, I'll put this as a question. Maybe does that feel to you like it's maybe like an example of that kind of locality thing where rather than having the dev environment, the integration environment, int 1 through 5, and then QA 5 through 17, and then 18, 1, 2, 3, demo, sales demo. like Pete's speech special demo, don't touch, and then prod, and hopefully, they're all the same. It feels like one of the things I love about like trunk-based development, feature flagging, all of those kind of techniques is it drives you towards kind of slicing down some of those environments so that you're working closer to production.
Oh, for sure. And one of the parts of the first ideal that it took me years to fully understand. I mean, I kind of understood it intellectually, but never really experienced until very recently was, I think one element of the first ideal is, to what extent can you test things in isolation from everything else? Can you actually, and if, let's do it the other way. Not ideal is the only way you can get reasonable assurance that something will work in production is by testing it in the presence of every other component, right? Which is terrible, because if you have side effects, right, it means that the only way you can actually test the customer orders is by generating real customer orders, right? So one of the things I learned in my closure experience, so this functional programming language that runs on the JVM. And I think it really adopts so much of the sensibilities of functional programming, where you really separate the side effects from everything else. And what I learned is, when you can decouple these pieces from each other, you can actually test these things in isolation, right? You can actually remove the side affecting parts and just test the business logic or the other parts of the functionality. And to the extent that made the code that I wrote safer and more reliable, it defies easy explanation. But I think things like that definitely make it possible to be able to do reasonable testing without the need for these incredibly scarce and fragile integrated test environments. So does that resonate with you, Pete?
Yeah, for sure. Like I think we share a mutual hatred of shared mutable state. It's a necessary evil, because it turns out the world has state, but yeah, I've had that exact same experience of working with functional languages and having that kind of epiphany of like, whoa. Like, what's outside? It's like, it's pure. And good example of that locality for sure.
In fact, I mean, the aha moment for me was watching a talk from Scott Havens, who came from Jet.com, that got acquired by Walmart. And he described how, and so that was written in F#, a functional programming language for all of the supply chain systems. And so his remit at Walmart was to re-engineer the entire inventory management systems at Walmart. And so he gave a talk at DevOps Enterprise that just blew me away. He said, so when you go to the, any of the Walmart e-commerce properties and do an item lookup, that requires 23 deeply nested API calls. Is the item available? In what warehouses? What are the shipping transport options? What zip code are you in? What are the fulfillment options? So that means you have 23 services that all have to be tier 1, 4 nines, respond in 50 milliseconds or less. Very, very expensive. And he basically used kind of this event sourcing architecture using functional programming principles to basically turn those 23 deeply nested APIs into one key value lookup. and so that was safer, cheaper, more reliable, and it took a team of less than 5 people to do.
I was thinking about this, and I'm writing notes in the EPUB book, and I was like, Gene, tell me more about how this happens. And then I read 2 paragraphs ahead, and I'm like, oh, there, it's explained right there. And I'm going to try to play this back and tell me if I get this right. So the first case is you kick off this command that has to go streaming through all these different things and come back with answers in darn near real time, or the customer's going to suffer.
Yep.
In the second case, you're kind of pre-computing the answer based on events coming in. When a shipment carrier says they're changing how they deliver, or when an item changes its availability, that event basically populates what I'm going to call a lookup table. So imagine instead of having to run 23 commands, you're actually just going and looking in a lookup table somewhere, what's the shipment details for product X? And right, so you're
for every product, for every warehouse, for every zip code.
Compute. Well, you don't make the changes that often.
That's right.
And when you make them, yes, there may be something that looks almost like a batch job that's running for even an hour, but now for the next week, 30 days, whatever, you've got zero latency answers to the questions, right?
Exactly.
Sort of, right?
Yeah, it literally is a tuple of for every zip code, for every product, for every warehouse, for every shipping transport option. What are my shipping transport options and whatever. Just pre-compute all of those and store it in a key value lookup store, which is inherently very simple, very reliable, and it's very easy to run it 4 or 5 nines. So yeah, that was exactly right. And you also decouple these systems from each other. Right. And Scott Havens has this amazing part in his talk where he says all of these things are unit testable. They can be totally tested in isolation from each other without in a unit test, which I thought was one of the most remarkable gobsmacking things I've ever heard.
Cool. So I'm going to quickly look over we sort of had some lists ahead of time. We had no idea exactly how this was going to go, right? So we kind of thought about some topics around each of the 5 ideals.
Can I ask a question? So, because I feel like we've focused a lot on. I think that naturally kind of focused a lot on those first 2 ideals. I want to ask a question about kind of customer focus, and I guess this is customer focus and a little bit of number 3 as well, improvement daily work. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is platform teams. And do you think, Gene, that if I'm a platform, if I'm working for some central, so when I say platform team, I mean some team that's building kind of shared services that other parts of the engineering organization are using, who's my customer there? Should I be thinking about the people, the people who are walking into a Parts Unlimited store to buy brake pads, or should I be thinking about the engineers who are using my stuff, or is it a little bit of both, or what?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. So platform teams, boy, that's a really great question. So, by definition, the people walking into a Parts Unlimited retail store are not going to be ascribe a lot of value to the.
They don't care about
internal,
Reddit.
right, or the feature flagging system, or the logging frameworks, or whatever. But it's not to say that they're not a beneficiary of it. The internal customer really are the developers, right? And I think kind of there is, whether stated explicitly or not, there's an internal marketplace of how much do people love the internal platforms, right? Do they choose to use the internal platform, or do they use an external vendor?
There you go.
But I think I find that the dev productivity teams, of which I would call the platform teams, have to be the most sophisticated people around, because they not only need to understand the developers, but they also have to have an innate kind of understanding of what developers need in order to achieve their goals. So they're the internal munitions manufacturers, right, to help win the war that the organization is in, to beat the competition.
They're kind of like almost like product managers.
Oh, for sure, right. But it's product managers not for parochial benefit, right? It is really about what helps us, our developer customers, help the organization that we serve. And so it's interesting to me that at the tech giants, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, they put their best product owners and best engineers on those platforms. Whereas I think in most typical organizations, people will put the best developers on the features. Whereas there's a complete inversion, at the tech giants.
One word: leverage.
I was about to say I was thinking of the exact same thing. It makes sense, right? Leverage, you can get 10x, a good engineer can empower 50 or 100 or 1,000 engineers to do 1% better. That's amazing. You're getting so much leverage out of that good engineer, right? I mean, all engineers are good in different ways, but an engineer that's particularly talented in one way, leverage.
Oh, for sure. And I love the Satya Nadella quote. He said in a town hall earlier this year, if a developer ever has to choose between working on a feature versus something that will improve productivity, always choose productivity. And so, as you said, right, that they're playing the forever game. They're using compounding interest to their benefit, as opposed to most organizations, they use it to the detriment because of technical debt. Just, but I want to show you a picture. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, I'll unshare here. I haven't shared a while ago, actually. My bad. Hang on.
Yeah, so the big aha moment for me, for customer focus, was hanging out with Dr. McKirsten. We're at Compuware visiting the CEO, Chris O'Malley, who I learned so much from over the years. And the first, walking to the campus, and I look at the agenda, and the first thing on the agenda is a data center tour. And I actually apologize to my friend Mick. I'm so sorry. I thought this was going to be a great day. I have no idea why we're doing this. I'm not sure what we're going to learn by seeing a bunch of halon extinguishers, but it was again, one of those aha moments that has changed how I think about things. And because what we saw in the data center was this. It was empty. It was.
I was hoping you'd go to this. I was curious. I saw this in a video you did recently, and I was like, "Is that for real?"
Yeah. In fact, so this is So you walk in the data center. There's 2 Z mainframes, and there's these outlines like in a murder scene where the racks used to be, and in the middle of the outlines are the names of the applications and business processes that used to be there and how much money they save by getting rid of it. And so that's the notion of core versus context. Core is what creates lasting, durable business advantage that customers are willing to pay us for. Context is everything else. So context can be mission critical, but context can starve core. And so by doing this, they were able to reallocate $8 million back into things that customers cared about, which is R&D, right? And so I just thought this was such a magnificent example of,
You worked into the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So where did these servers go? Are these replaced with SaaS, or are they gone to the cloud, or they're off on the farm somewhere?
18 tons of obsolete equipment removed and recycled, and they were replaced by SaaS vendors.
Gotcha.
They moved from I think it was Oracle Financials to NetSuite and Salesforce. That's the majority of the business processes that run through those, and they got rid of they went from 3 different treasury functions to 1. On-prem email went is now in the cloud, right? So it's competitive advantage is not derived through those back office functions, which I just thought was just a incredible depiction.
I love this kind of this celebration as well. Like I feel like that to me, that's kind of like one of those psychological safety things is you're kind of like really strongly signaling to everyone in the organization, like this is something that we can celebrate and move past and move to this kind of bright new future, rather than it being kind of like either not a big deal or something that kind of it was someone's job to plug the network cables into these machines, right?
And kind of in the end of the book, there's a tremendous amount of soul searching, right? That's what a great litmus says. Are customers willing to pay us for it? It's some of the most treasured things that Maxine worked on over the years. Ended up on that, ended up on the loading docks with sledgehammers being taken to them, right? Some with more zeal than others, and including the CI platform that they built, where ultimately this was it was kind of judged to be a sink of their best talent, right? Is this something that we can rely on a vendor for? And I think there's a whole class of technologies where if it's not a core competency that customers are willing to pay us for, then let's use a service from a vendor where it is their chosen core competency, and then we benefit from every one of their innovations.
I had a question about that. What I want to ask about core versus context, right? So I think if we look back, I think you just answered my first question, which was going to be, what was build 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, or build and operate, which is now buy, or, and, it's funny, the old word was outsource, but outsource was just sort of about moving the blame around and like trying to get economies of scale, as opposed to whose job is this, who does this really well that I could just plug into. So, I think HR, email, financials, that's all on demand, right? So I'm kind of coming up with a phrase, what will be context on tap in the next 2 to 3 years, right?
Oh.
Like what have people been building that will probably be, no one would go out and build Jira, right? No one's gonna, and somebody's probably still got a Jira that they built themselves.
Building Jira right now.
Well, there you go. So somebody probably has one and is thinking, I'll put more investment into it because I really like it. It's my baby. But it like this whole notion of core versus context. And I once a couple of years ago I was at a conference and talked to some people and what we came back with was, do you want to be working on the truck or delivering software? Right. So what do you think? I'm crystal ball, like what is, do you have any idea, like if you're to kind of, obviously I'm a little biased because I personally think that everyone and their brother has some kind of feature flagging solution. And I think that we're already well underway with some of the people where they're like, yeah, I don't want to be in that business. I don't want to have 4 of them in my company.
2 or 3 of them actually.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to have, and what's funny is that sometimes when people come to us is that it's not it's because they've got several, and rather than pick a winner, kill the others, pronounce some group in charge, and still have an ongoing maintenance nightmare, they're like, we just want to get out. We just don't want to have to resolve that. We're just going to migrate to something that we can plug into. And it sounds like you've run into this pattern as well, Pete.
Yeah, I think like so many of these. I think it's almost a truism that for many of these vendors, large and small, right? Often the biggest the biggest competition is internal. Someone built one, and I think the what is often not properly valued is the opportunity cost, right? So I'd love this. There's a blog post by the famous investor Brad Feld who said, you can actually increase gross margin by buying your own servers, right? Because you can capitalize it and it does sort of great things to the financial statement. And I told that to a friend of mine, and he just laughed. He said, "Yeah, that's true, but what is not factored in there is the opportunity cost. Ideally, we want to hire developers to build features, not keep propping up these things in our data centers." And I thought that was just a really great example. And I think that is just as true, probably even more true, for internal development platforms. We want our developers' best energies working on features, and so we'll do whatever it takes to get those developers productive. But if there's if we can sort of have those developers work on things that aren't provided by vendors, that's even better. I think the kind of the surprising kind of another counterintuitive case of this is that often Scott Prue, he's the SVP of R&D at CSG, the U.S. The nation's largest bill printing company, and he described this amazing amount of work they've done in the last 6 years to get away from dangerous vendors, as defined by the people who triple their cost during the annual the negotiation process, the people who capriciously change the licensing models, and they're an organization that had to increase their transaction count by 10x, and so if they had stayed kind of on their current technologies, they would not be profitable. And so this is an example where in some cases they've actually rebuilt systems just to get away from these dangerous vendors. Because what they needed to do was being actively jeopardized by their vendors. So I think kind of it turns out that wasn't context. They actually had to make it core. And I'm sure if they could find a better vendor, right, they would move to it. But I think kind of that's wonderful to see kind of the great, amazing decisions that are made kind of through that lens.
Yeah, so I'm going to give the audience a heads up. Go ahead and submit questions. We're going to move to Q&A pretty soon here. So those of you who are watching, if you want to kind of just fire in some questions, that'd be great. I think, Gene, in your book, I mean, I could drill into parts of the book over and over again. The one thing I thought was cool is there's a, and I don't want to do too much of a spoiler here, but there's a point where it's looking like there could be like a really ugly bloodbath in the company of laying people off and all sorts of bad stuff happening. And actually it became a liberation, right? So the people, few left, most just got to do a much better job and live in a much more interesting world. And I think that this is one of those kind of a leap of faith thing, which is like, if you're attached and you cling to the thing which isn't really working, but is your baby, you're stuck. But if you actually are willing to kind of take the leap and look at a different way of solving a problem, and this is totally tied in with core versus context.
Yeah, for sure. And I think kind of the main lesson for me was, in fact, going to that data center picture, right? Pete, you alluded to, it was someone's job, to build up that data center over decades, and then it became their job to tear it down. And I got to ask that person, like, how did it feel? And he said it felt terrible, right? Because and so you have to. It became so important to memorialize and celebrate each thing that left the data center, right? And celebrate as each piece, leaves and goes to a better place. and because and Chris O'Malley, the CEO, he said it was actually sort of misplaced pride, right? We built up pride over these achievements of the last decade, but if it's not creating value in the eyes of the customer, then maybe it was misplaced pride. And kind of if you continue that kind of reasoning, as we move people from context to core, they're in a far better place to create value for the customer. And it turns out there's actually more budget there, and there's more, there's fewer restrictions. And, if you need to do something, the business will find the money, right? And so it's actually a far better place to end up.
And I think it's more like, I think it's just fundamentally more satisfying. Like it sounds a little bit, my locality in California maybe is coming out. It sounds a little bit like touchy-feely to say it's more satisfying, but I do think humans want to have impact on the world. And when you realize that you're having much greater impact by, you can get more stuff done by configuring cloud services than plugging network cables in, then I think when you can get to that place, you realize that you can have more satisfaction in your work.
Oh my gosh! In fact, here's like one of the worst things I've ever heard in my career. Someone said, I remember being a part of the mobile apps team for this bank, and it was 2 of the years of the most satisfying experience because we knew everything we were doing was help to advance very specific objectives around customer acquisition, improving the funnel, etc. And then he moved to this enterprise shared service, and the thing he hears most from his colleagues are, stay out of the business. And it's just, I can't imagine sort of like a worse thing and more mean-spirited thing to say to someone.
Get back in your box.
Get back in your box. And so, I think this is another way to sort of reinforce what your claim, Pete, is that life is a lot more fun and satisfying, when you're actually part of that team trying to achieve a goal that you can tightly link to the mission of the organization.
Yeah.
And no one's going to say, "Get back in your box, stay out of the business."
It's funny because I have a friend who fairly young, worked in a fairly large legacy organization and found some significant, like $100,000 worth of saving that was kind of a no-brainer. And they said, hey, every time we turn the crank, we're billing $10 million. So $100,000, like, we don't care. And it was more than her salary at the time. She's pretty junior, right? And so to her, it's like, wait a minute, what? Like, right? Like, this is sort of a no-brainer, but so I think it's like not the notion that you should sort of stay in your lane and don't actually care about the company as a whole is pretty crazy.
Pretty crazy. Yeah. And I think that's kind of, the goal of leaders is really to sort of enable the opposite behaviors and discourage some of the behaviors they talk about, right? If we've got even cost centers, right? The goal is to create excellence so that, we can dedicate more people, time, energy to things that customers care about. In the military, they have the notion of like the tooth to tail ratio, right? They want to maximize the amount of teeth and minimize the tail, right? Same thing in any organization with a real mission.
I'm going to jump into some questions, Gene and Pete. So the first one is kind of meaty. I'll read this one. This one's from Aaron. Can you talk through high level what a successful 2-week release cycle might look like from a QA or engineering perspective? And the context is that they're moving from like a 6-week to a 2 weeks cadence, right? They want to move from 6 weeks to 2-week cadence. And the concerns are, the upside is, if it hurts, do it more often. But the concerns are like, what's it like? The concerns are, what about QA? And, is the key make small changes and release often, or what's the best way to transition from 6 weeks to 2 weeks?
Pete, you want to take that first crack at that?
I talk to people about this quite a lot. So I think that the question is kind of asking a lot about QA, and I think their instinct is 100% right. That's the biggest challenge is keeping safe, feeling like you're not going to introduce a bunch of bugs into production, particularly if you're coming from a world of 6-week release cycles. That means you probably have a feature freeze and the ability to kind of like do a bunch of manual regression. And as your tempo goes up, you have to figure out ways to get the same assurances but change your practices. So I think like a lot of this is around two main things. I don't think I could literally talk for an hour about this, but I think to me, two main things. One is test automation, figuring out ways to get that quality through automated tests that run throughout your release cycle, not at the end. And then the second thing, and I promise this isn't a plug, is some ability to deploy code without turning on a feature. So a feature flag, for example,
so that the riskier changes you can roll out and without, you don't have to kind of stop the release because you haven't had time to test something. You just don't turn that feature on. That's like the very, very short Cliff Notes perspective from my perspective. I think those are the two main things.
Yeah, and I'll add, for these kind of non-functional requirements of security QA, it ends up with kind of moving more into a coaching and consulting role. One of the factors that we found in the State of DevOps report is that the less developers, the question was, who owns maintaining the library of tests? And the more the answer wasn't developers, the worse the outcomes. It says that QA is no longer responsible for writing and running the tests. It is really helping developers write and run and maintain those effective tests to minimize the number of defects that we care about, and that is just as applicable for security as well.
Yeah. So actually, cool segue from what Pete was saying. We've moved back-end and API development to continuous delivery, but we've faced difficulties proving that CD is also possible and valuable for delivering native mobile apps. Do you have any experience transitioning teams that deal with external publishing systems like the App Store and the Play Store to continuous delivery?
Pete.
I definitely do. So I did this at a giant bank, one of the big five banks in the US, a lot like seven years ago. It was possible then. It's even more possible now. I just recently helped a startup bank do it. Continuous delivery, all of those practices can work exactly the same. You just don't get to push the button to deploy to prod as often. Certain vendors, Apple, make it harder, but it is possible to do it. And I think for me, the biggest blocker for this is getting engineers into the mindset of doing it. The tools are available, more so in Android ecosystem than the Apple ecosystem. But the mindset shift is the biggest challenge, particularly, honestly, for iOS folks, because I think they just don't come from a mindset of doing it. But you can absolutely do it. I've seen it done successfully. Like I said, I just recently watched a pretty large startup move from a 6-week release cycle to a 2-week release cycle, and it actually wasn't that painful. And you just use all the same tools that you would for other things.
Sorry to jump in, just a heads up, we probably will go dark right at 11 o'clock. So if there's questions we haven't answered yet, we're going to send them out with a slide as I'm recording. Sorry that little last minute zinger, but I think one of the questions I'm going to have you answer maybe offline, Gene, is the name of your company, IT Revolution. Kind of thinking that this part of this is about there needs to be a revolution, and in the book there's a revolution, right? So we'll probably get to that. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I have a feeling that our moments are seconds away from sort of saying woohoo. But again, thank you, everybody. We're going to have a recording. And Gene, thanks so much for making the time to talk to us live today. It's pretty awesome.
It was a delight to be on here, both with you, Dave, and with Pete. So this is so much fun to be in the company of kindred spirits.
On that note, I'll put the animated unicorn that our awesome graphic artist did back up on the screen here. Thanks again, everybody. We will be in touch by email and share the goods with you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Cheers all. Bye-bye.